Imagine being at the peak of your career, respected by everyone, with an impeccable reputation, only to discover that everything you believe to be true might be a lie. Under the Weight of Truth takes you deep into the mind of Michael Rourke, a renowned prosecutor who finds himself entangled in a conspiracy far more complex than a simple corruption case. But what if those you trust are the very ones manipulating the system? And what if the evidence that seemed so solid actually hides something much darker? In this gripping legal thriller, every decision Michael makes could mean the difference between justice and total destruction. He's willing to risk everything, putting it all on the line to expose a network of corruption that threatens not just his career, but his life. As you delve into this world of betrayal, power, and vengeance, you'll face a chilling question: how far would you go to uncover the truth? Michael Rourke stood in his office, gazing out at the Manhattan skyline. The weight of his upcoming case pressed heavily on his shoulders. As a top prosecutor with a sterling reputation, Michael had tackled some of the most complex cases in New York. But this one was different. Lucas Ford, a billionaire tech mogul, was on the brink of being brought to justice for corruption and fraud. The evidence against Ford was overwhelming: bank records, encrypted messages decrypted, and witnesses ready to testify. This case would be the crowning achievement of Michael's career. On the morning of the indictment, Michael reviewed the case files one last time. Everything seemed airtight. He had the confidence of someone who had done this countless times before. Yet, a nagging feeling of unease gnawed at him, a sensation he couldn't quite shake. As he was about to head to the courtroom, his assistant, Jessica, entered with a perplexed look on her face. "Michael, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent," she said, her tone reflecting the oddity of the situation. Michael frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone, and his schedule was packed. But something in Jessica's voice made him curious. He nodded and followed her to the conference room. Inside, a man in an ordinary gray suit sat at the far end of the table. He looked unremarkable, almost as if he were designed to blend into the background. The man didn't offer his name, didn't shake hands, he simply slid a folder across the table toward Michael. "This will change everything," the man said, his voice steady and low. Michael hesitated but then opened the folder. Inside, he found documents, emails, bank statements, a list of names that made his heart race. They suggested that someone within the legal system, possibly someone close to him, had manipulated evidence to frame Lucas Ford. The accusations were staggering. If true, this meant that the case Michael had built so meticulously was based on lies. Michael looked up, but the man was already standing to leave. "Who are you?" Michael demanded, his mind reeling from the implications of what he had just seen. "That's not important," the man replied calmly. "What matters is what you do next." And with that, he walked out, leaving Michael alone with the folder and a growing sense of dread. Back in his office, Michael locked the door and sat down with the documents. The more he read, the more the solid case against Lucas Ford began to unravel in his mind. How could he have missed this? How deep did this conspiracy go? And more troubling, who could he trust? He picked up the phone to call the deputy district attorney, but his hand hovered over the receiver. Could he really go through with this? Exposing the truth would mean risking everything he had worked for, everything he believed in. But burying it, that would make him complicit in a lie. As he sat there, the memories of a past mistake, something he had buried deep, a scandal from his early career, began to surface. Michael had managed to keep it hidden all these years, but now, it seemed that the sins of his past were catching up to him. With the clock ticking and the trial looming, Michael knew he had to make a choice. But either way, the weight of the truth was crushing, and the path ahead was anything but clear. Michael's mind raced as he stared at the documents before him. The damning evidence against Lucas Ford had been his ticket to professional glory, but now, these new revelations threatened to unravel everything. He needed to think, to process, but there was no time. The trial was days away, and every moment he spent in indecision brought him closer to a disaster that could destroy not just his case, but his entire career. He stood abruptly, pacing his office. The room, usually a place of calm and order, felt suffocating. He picked up the phone, his fingers hovering over the keypad. Calling the deputy district attorney, Melissa Hampton, seemed the logical step. But the voice of the man who'd handed him the documents echoed in his mind. What matters is what you do next. Could Melissa be trusted? Was she part of this? He couldn't shake the feeling that the conspiracy reached far beyond what was in front of him. With a deep breath, Michael decided against making the call, at least for now. Instead, he needed to investigate quietly, to find out just how deep this went before exposing himself. He grabbed the folder, tucking it under his arm, and left his office, nodding briefly at Jessica as he passed her desk. "Hold my calls for a bit," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. As he stepped outside, the crisp air hit him, clearing his head slightly. He needed to start somewhere, and the first person who came to mind was his longtime assistant, Daniel. Daniel had been with him through every major case, proving time and again his loyalty and sharp instincts. If anyone could help make sense of this without raising suspicion, it was him. Michael found Daniel in the records room, hunched over a stack of files. When Daniel saw Michael, he immediately stood up, concern flashing across his face. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Not far from it," Michael replied, handing the folder to Daniel. "Take a look at this. Tell me what you think." Daniel opened the folder, his eyes scanning the contents. As he read, his brow furrowed deeper and deeper. After a few minutes, he looked up, his expression a mix of disbelief and fear. "This is huge. If this is true, it's not just Lucas Ford we're dealing with. This could go all the way to the top." "I know," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need you to dig into this quietly. No one can know, not yet. We can't trust anyone until we're sure." Daniel nodded, but Michael could see the worry in his eyes. "You realize what this means, right? If these documents are legitimate, we're talking about a major conspiracy. And if they're fake, someone's setting you up." "That's why we have to be careful," Michael replied, clenching his fists. "We need to find out who's behind this, before they find out we're onto them." Daniel agreed and promised to start digging right away. As he left the room, Michael felt a pang of guilt for dragging Daniel into this. But there was no turning back now. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that this was not just about Lucas Ford. It was about something much bigger, something that had the potential to shake the entire foundation of the justice system. Michael returned to his office, closing the door behind him. His gaze fell on the framed photograph of his family on his desk, his wife, Claire, and their 2 children, smiling on a summer vacation. The thought of losing everything he had worked so hard to build, everything he held dear, weighed heavily on him. But he couldn't ignore what he had found. The truth was out there, and he had a duty to uncover it, no matter the cost. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Jessica again, looking more nervous than before. "Melissa Hampton is here to see you," she said. "She says it's urgent." Michael's heart skipped a beat. Melissa wasn't supposed to know about the documents, no one was. He quickly composed himself, nodding to Jessica. "Send her in." As Melissa entered the office, Michael couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment everything would begin to unravel. Melissa Hampton entered Michael's office with an air of urgency, her usual composed demeanor replaced by something more anxious, almost frantic. Michael stood by his desk, trying to read her expression, but her face betrayed little. "Michael," she began, closing the door behind her, "we need to talk." "Of course," he replied, forcing a calmness he didn't feel. "What's on your mind?" Melissa glanced around the room, as if ensuring they were truly alone, before stepping closer. "It's about the Ford case," she said in a low voice. "There's something you need to know." Michael's heart raced. Was she about to reveal something connected to the documents he'd just received? Or was this something else entirely? He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. "What is it?" Michael asked, his voice betraying the tension he felt. Melissa hesitated, then spoke in a hurried whisper. "I've been getting some unsettling information. Sources I trust are saying there's more to this case than we realized. It's not just Ford. There's a possibility that..." She stopped abruptly, her eyes narrowing as if she was reconsidering how much to reveal. "Melissa," Michael said, stepping closer, "if you know something, you need to tell me. We're on the same side here." She looked him in the eyes, searching for something, perhaps reassurance. Finally, she sighed and lowered her voice further. "I've heard rumors, Michael. People high up, in positions of power, they're saying this case isn't what it seems. They're hinting that we're being used, manipulated. I've even heard that evidence might have been planted. I thought it was just paranoia, but now I'm not so sure." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. The parallels with the documents he'd been given were too strong to ignore. But if Melissa was being honest, then she wasn't part of the conspiracy, she was another potential victim of it, just like him. "I've come to you because I don't know who else to trust," Melissa continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "If we're walking into a trap, we need to figure it out before it's too late." Michael's mind raced. If Melissa was in the dark, then she wasn't behind the documents he'd received. But that didn't mean she was safe. In fact, it could mean they were both in danger. "Thank you for telling me," Michael said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need to be careful about how we proceed. If there's even a chance that this case has been tampered with, we have to find out who's behind it and why." Melissa nodded, relief washing over her features. "I knew I could count on you, Michael. We'll have to keep this quiet, though. If anyone finds out we're investigating our own case." "I know," Michael replied, his thoughts racing. We can't trust anyone, at least not until we know more. Melissa finally sat down, her posture still tense. So, what's our next move? Michael hesitated, considering his options. He couldn't tell her about the documents just yet. Not until he knew more about them and who had sent them. But he needed to keep Melissa close, both as an ally and to monitor her for any signs of deception. We need to double-check everything, he said. Go over all the evidence again, see if anything stands out. We'll also need to look into the sources of the evidence, where it came from, who handled it, everything. Melissa nodded, already thinking ahead. I can start on that right away. And, Michael, be careful. If we're right about this, we're up against something much bigger than just Ford. As she left the office, Michael sank into his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He was no longer just prosecuting a case, he was unraveling a conspiracy that could destroy careers, reputations, and lives. He picked up the phone and called Daniel. I need you to focus on those documents, he said. And one more thing, keep an eye on Melissa Hampton. We're working together on this, but I'm not ready to share everything yet. I need to know if she's being honest with me. Daniel agreed, his voice tinged with concern. This is getting dangerous, Michael. Are you sure about this? I don't have a choice, Michael replied, his voice grim. We're in too deep now. As he hung up the phone, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that every move he made was being scrutinized by unseen eyes. The walls were closing in, and the line between friend and foe was becoming increasingly blurred. For the first time in his career, Michael wasn't sure if he was going to make it out of this case unscathed. The following day, Michael arrived at the courthouse early, determined to keep his focus. The tension that had settled over him like a heavy fog the night before hadn't lifted. As he prepared for the day's proceedings, he found himself going over the evidence in his mind, searching for any signs of manipulation, any detail that didn't quite fit. Melissa was already in the courtroom when Michael entered, a stack of files in front of her. She glanced up and offered a tense smile. I went through everything last night, she said quietly. So far, nothing stands out as obviously tampered with, but I'm still looking. Michael nodded, grateful for her diligence. Keep digging. If there's something there, we'll find it. As the courtroom filled with reporters and spectators, Michael caught sight of Lucas Ford at the defense table, his expression calm, almost smug. Ford's attorney, a high-powered defense lawyer named Alan Weissman, whispered something in his ear, and Ford smirked, his gaze briefly meeting Michael's. It was as if Ford knew something Michael didn't, a secret he was daring Michael to uncover. The thought gnawed at him as the judge entered the room and called the session to order. The morning's proceedings were routine, a motion to suppress some evidence, a debate over witness lists, but Michael's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that the trial was a charade, that something vital was being hidden in plain sight. He glanced at Melissa, who was busily taking notes, her brow furrowed in concentration. When the session broke for lunch, Michael excused himself and made his way to a small, rarely used conference room at the back of the courthouse. He needed a moment to think, to process everything without the prying eyes of colleagues and opponents. But as he entered the room and closed the door behind him, he found he wasn't alone. Sitting at the table, waiting for him, was Daniel. Daniel, Michael said, startled, what are you doing here? Daniel stood, a file in his hand, his expression serious. I found something, he said, his voice low. It's about the evidence we've been looking into. There's a discrepancy in the chain of custody records, something that doesn't make sense. Michael felt a surge of both dread and curiosity. What did you find? Daniel handed over the file. The digital records we have from the forensic team, they were altered. I checked the original timestamps, and they don't match up with the logs we've been using in court. Someone tampered with them before they were submitted as evidence. Michael's stomach dropped. This was the proof he feared and anticipated. Someone within the system had manipulated the evidence against Ford, and they had done it well enough to almost escape detection. Do you know who? Michael asked, already dreading the answer. Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. Not yet. But whoever did this had access to the forensic lab, and they knew exactly what they were doing. It's sophisticated, Michael, too sophisticated for just anyone. This was planned. Michael's thoughts raced. The implications were enormous. If the evidence had been tampered with, the entire case against Lucas Ford could collapse. Worse, if word got out that the prosecution had used falsified evidence, Michael's career could be over. He could face disbarment, criminal charges even. And the person who orchestrated this? They were still out there, watching, waiting. Does anyone else know? Michael asked, his voice tight. Just you and me, Daniel replied. And I plan to keep it that way until we figure out our next move. Michael nodded, trying to think clearly. We need to be smart about this. If we go public too soon, it'll blow up in our faces. We have to find out who's behind this, and why." Daniel leaned closer. "There's something else," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I looked into Melissa Hampton, like you asked. She's been in contact with someone from Ford's legal team." Michael's breath caught in his throat. "What? Are you sure?" Daniel nodded grimly. "I traced a series of encrypted messages between her and one of Ford's junior lawyers. I couldn't decrypt everything, but the timing. It lines up too perfectly to be a coincidence." Betrayal washed over Michael like a cold wave. Melissa had seemed so earnest, so concerned about the truth. But now, it appeared she might be playing both sides, feeding information to Ford's team while pretending to help Michael. "What do we do?" Daniel asked, his voice steady but urgent. Michael clenched his fists, the realization settling in. The trial had become a minefield, and every step could be his last. "We keep this to ourselves for now," he said finally. "We can't confront her until we know exactly what she's up to. Keep digging, but be careful. If she suspects anything, we're done." Daniel nodded, his expression resolute. "I'll be careful. But Michael, be careful too. This is getting dangerous." Michael forced a grim smile. "I will." As Daniel left the room, Michael felt the walls closing in around him. The victory he had once been so sure of now felt like an illusion, slipping through his fingers. He had believed he was fighting for justice, but now he realized that the battle was far more personal, far more dangerous. Returning to the courtroom for the afternoon session, Michael took his seat, his mind swirling with the new information. Melissa sat beside him, her face a mask of professionalism, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. As the session began, Michael knew that the real fight was no longer in the courtroom. It was in the shadows, where trust was a commodity and betrayal could come from anyone. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the afternoon session dragged on. Michael sat rigidly at the prosecution table, his eyes on the judge, but his mind was far from the legal arguments being presented. He stole a glance at Melissa, who appeared calm and focused, jotting down notes as if nothing was amiss. The thought that she could be working against him, manipulating the case from within, gnawed at him like a persistent itch he couldn't scratch. As the day's proceedings came to a close, Michael gathered his papers, forcing himself to maintain his composure. Melissa turned to him, her expression neutral. "We made some good progress today," she said, as if the weight of the world wasn't pressing down on them both. "Yeah, we did," Michael replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "But there's still a lot to do. Let's regroup tomorrow and go over the strategy." Melissa nodded, and for a moment, Michael almost believed her. But the unease in his gut told him otherwise. He needed to find out what she knew, and quickly, before she could cause any more damage. That evening, after leaving the courthouse, Michael didn't head straight home. Instead, he drove through the city's dimming streets until he reached a small, nondescript bar tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. It was a place he frequented when he needed to think, away from the pressures of his life and the prying eyes of his colleagues. He sat at the far end of the bar, nursing a whiskey and staring blankly at the television that played silently in the background. His mind churned over the events of the past few days, replaying every conversation, every detail, searching for answers. The door to the bar swung open, and Daniel walked in, his face tense as he spotted Michael. He joined him at the bar, ordering a beer before speaking. "I did some more digging," Daniel said quietly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the bar. "It's worse than we thought." Michael's stomach tightened. "What did you find?" Daniel took a deep breath, his gaze serious. "Melissa's been in contact with Ford's team for weeks, maybe longer. She's been passing them information, our strategies, witness lists, everything. But that's not the worst part." Michael braced himself. "What is?" "There's a money trail," Daniel said, his voice grim. "She's been receiving payments, funneled through offshore accounts. It's a classic bribery scheme, but it's sophisticated. Someone's gone to great lengths to cover it up. Whoever's behind this is pulling a lot of strings." Michael felt the blood drain from his face. Melissa had been in his office, his confidence, and all the while, she was selling them out. "Did you find out who's paying her?" Daniel shook his head. "Not yet. But the payments are significant, more than enough to make someone risk everything. She's deep in this, Michael, and I don't think she's working alone." Michael's mind raced. Melissa's betrayal was more than just a professional setback, it was a personal one. He had trusted her, relied on her, and now, everything he had worked for was in jeopardy. But worse still, if Melissa wasn't working alone, it meant the conspiracy reached even further than he'd imagined. "We need proof," Michael said finally, his voice firm. "Something we can use to bring her down. If we confront her now, she'll deny everything, and we'll lose our chance to expose this." Daniel nodded in agreement. I'll keep digging, see if I can trace the money back to its source. But we have to be careful. If she finds out we're onto her, she could disappear, or worse, turn the tables on us." Michael understood the gravity of the situation. Melissa was dangerous, and the people she was working with were even more so. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. As Daniel left the bar, Michael stayed behind, staring into his glass. The fight was no longer just about Lucas Ford's guilt or innocence, it was about uncovering a network of corruption that threatened to destroy him. The stakes had never been higher, and the risks never greater. When Michael finally left the bar, the city was quiet, the streets empty. He drove home in silence, his thoughts dark and troubled. He knew he couldn't trust anyone, not even the people he once considered allies. The line between friend and enemy had blurred beyond recognition, and now, every move he made could be his last. The next morning, Michael arrived at the courthouse with a sense of foreboding. As he walked through the corridors, the usual hustle and bustle of the building seemed distant, almost surreal. He had always felt at home in these halls, but now they felt like a maze, filled with hidden traps and unseen dangers. Melissa was already in the office when Michael arrived, her expression calm as she reviewed the day's agenda. "Morning, Michael," she said with a smile that now seemed so practiced, so false. "Morning," Michael replied, forcing himself to match her tone. "Ready for another day?" "Always," Melissa said, her eyes briefly meeting his before returning to her work. Michael turned to his desk, his mind racing. He needed to play along, to act as if nothing was wrong, even as he laid the groundwork to bring her down. But the pressure was mounting, and he knew that time was running out. As the trial resumed, Michael found it increasingly difficult to focus. The arguments, the objections, the witness testimonies, all of it seemed to blur together as he grappled with the knowledge of what was happening behind the scenes. And all the while, Melissa sat beside him, playing her part to perfection, a performance that was as chilling as it was convincing. But then, as the day drew to a close, something unexpected happened. During a brief recess, as Michael prepared to leave the courtroom, Melissa leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "Michael," she said, her tone serious, "there's something you should know. It's about the evidence, there's been a development." Michael's heart skipped a beat. Was she about to confess? Or was this another trap, another layer of deception? "What do you mean?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "Not here," Melissa replied, her eyes darting around the room. "Meet me tonight, after the session ends. I'll explain everything." Michael nodded slowly, his mind spinning. Was this the moment he had been waiting for, or was it a setup? He couldn't afford to trust her, but he also couldn't ignore the possibility that she might be ready to come clean. As the session concluded, Michael's thoughts were in turmoil. He knew he had to be careful, that whatever happened next could change everything. Melissa's invitation could be the breakthrough he needed, or it could be the final nail in his coffin. That night, Michael waited in his car outside the courthouse, the city's lights flickering in the distance. The air was thick with anticipation, and every passing minute felt like an eternity. Finally, he saw Melissa emerge from the building, her pace quick as she headed toward a nearby alley. Michael followed her, his heart pounding in his chest. The alley was dark, the shadows deep, and as he approached, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Melissa was waiting for him, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice low and tense. "What's this about, Melissa?" Michael asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She hesitated, glancing around as if ensuring they were alone. "Michael, I've made a mistake. I've been involved in something I shouldn't have been. But it's not what you think. I was pressured, threatened. I didn't have a choice." Michael's pulse quickened. Was she truly confessing, or was this another ploy? "Who's behind it?" Michael demanded, stepping closer. Before she could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed down the alley. Both of them turned, and Michael's blood ran cold as he saw several figures emerging from the shadows, their faces hidden in the darkness. "Melissa, get back!" Michael shouted, reaching for her arm. But it was too late. The figures closed in, and Michael realized with a sickening clarity that they had been set up. "Run," he yelled, but Melissa was frozen in place, her eyes wide with fear. The last thing Michael saw before the world exploded into chaos was the glint of metal in the dim light, a weapon, aimed directly at them. The sharp crack of a gunshot echoed through the alley, followed by a second and third. Michael instinctively grabbed Melissa's arm and pulled her behind a stack of crates. His heart pounded, adrenaline flooding his system as he tried to process the chaos unfolding around him. He peered around the crates, catching a glimpse of the dark figures advancing, their footsteps heavy on the damp pavement. "We need to get out of here," he whispered urgently to Melissa, but she was paralyzed with fear, her eyes wide, breathing shallow. Michael shook her lightly, snapping her out of her shock. "Melissa! "Move," he hissed, pulling her to her feet. Together, they bolted toward the far end of the alley, the sound of footsteps and muffled voices behind them. Michael's mind raced. Who were these people? Was this part of the conspiracy? Had Melissa set him up, or had they both been lured into a trap? They reached the street, and Michael flagged down the first taxi he saw, yanking the door open and shoving Melissa inside before jumping in after her. "Drive. Now," he shouted at the startled driver. As the car sped off, Michael glanced back at the alley, watching as the figures disappeared into the night. Whoever they were, they weren't finished with him or Melissa. This was far from over. Melissa sat beside him, trembling, her eyes unfocused as she tried to catch her breath. Michael's mind spun with questions. Had she been honest with him, or was this just another layer of deception? He didn't know what to believe anymore. They rode in tense silence for several minutes before Melissa finally spoke, her voice hoarse and shaking. "I didn't know this would happen, Michael. I swear. I thought I could fix it. I was going to tell you everything." Michael clenched his fists, staring straight ahead. "Tell me the truth, Melissa. Now. Who's behind this?" She wiped at her face, her hands trembling. It's not just one person. It's bigger than you think. Ford's legal team is just part of it. There are people in the DA's office, people connected to the highest levels of the city's power structure. They've been manipulating cases for years, steering outcomes, protecting the people they want to protect. Her voice broke, and she swallowed hard. "I was pulled in, blackmailed. They threatened me, my family. I didn't know how deep it went until it was too late." Michael felt the weight of her words settle on him like a lead blanket. It was worse than he had imagined. If what she was saying was true, this wasn't just about Lucas Ford. It was about systemic corruption that reached into the heart of the very institution Michael had devoted his life to serving. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" Michael demanded, his voice tight with anger. "I wanted to," Melissa whispered, her eyes glistening with tears. "But I was scared. I thought I could handle it on my own, that I could find a way out without dragging you into it. But they were watching me, controlling everything." The car pulled up outside Michael's apartment building. He paid the driver and led Melissa up the stairs, his mind still spinning. Inside, he poured 2 glasses of water and handed one to her. They sat in the dimly lit kitchen, the tension between them palpable. "You need to tell me everything," Michael said firmly. "No more secrets." Melissa nodded, her voice trembling as she began to speak. "It started a few months ago. I got a message from someone, an anonymous email. They had information about my personal life, things I never thought anyone could find out. They threatened to ruin me, expose things that could destroy my career. At first, it was just small favors, passing along harmless information. But then they started asking for more. And when I hesitated, they made it clear they weren't bluffing." Michael listened intently, his anger growing with every word. Melissa had been compromised, and now they were both caught in the web of something far more dangerous than either of them had realized. "Who's pulling the strings?" Michael asked, his voice hard. Melissa shook her head. "I don't know exactly. They use intermediaries, people like Ford's lawyer. But I know it goes high up, judges, politicians, even people in the police department. They control the cases, the outcomes. And they've been doing it for years." Michael's mind raced. If this conspiracy was as widespread as Melissa claimed, taking it down would require more than just exposing Ford. They would need proof, something that could bring the entire network crashing down. But going after people this powerful meant risking everything, his career, his life. "Why now?" Michael asked, leaning forward. "Why tell me all this tonight?" Melissa's eyes filled with fear. "Because they know you're getting close. They knew about the documents you received. That's why they came after us tonight. They're not going to stop, Michael. They'll kill both of us if we don't stop them first." A heavy silence settled between them. Michael knew she was right. The people behind this conspiracy wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose them. "We need evidence," Michael said finally, his voice firm. "Something that ties them all together, emails, phone records, bank statements. Something that will hold up in court." "I've been collecting what I can," Melissa replied. "But it's not enough. They're careful, and they cover their tracks well." Michael stared at the table, deep in thought. This was no longer about winning a case or bringing down a single corrupt executive. It was about exposing a network that had embedded itself deep within the legal system. And if he failed, he wouldn't just lose his career, he'd lose his life. "We can't do this alone," Michael said finally. "We need allies, people we can trust." Melissa nodded, but the fear in her eyes remained. "Who can we trust, Michael? Everyone's compromised." He paused, thinking of Daniel. He had been loyal from the beginning, and if there was anyone Michael could count on, it was him. But even involving Daniel meant putting him in danger. I'll figure that out, Michael said, standing up. But we need to move quickly. Tomorrow, I'll start gathering what we need. You do the same. We'll meet again when it's safe. Melissa rose to leave, her face pale, but she looked more determined than before. Be careful, Michael. They'll be watching your every move. Michael nodded, but the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on him. The line between ally and enemy had blurred beyond recognition, and the path forward was treacherous. As he watched Melissa disappear into the night, Michael knew the battle had only just begun. The stakes were higher than ever, and the people behind the conspiracy would stop at nothing to protect their empire. But Michael had one advantage: they didn't know how far he was willing to go to bring them down. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the ultimate question remained: was he ready to pay the price for the truth? The following morning, Michael woke with a sense of urgency gnawing at him. There was no time to waste. He knew that each passing hour increased the likelihood that those behind the conspiracy would make their next move, one that could be fatal. He needed to act quickly and decisively, but most of all, he needed the truth. After a quick call to Daniel, they arranged to meet at a secluded cafe on the outskirts of the city, far from prying eyes. As Michael drove through the early morning fog, his thoughts raced. The events of the previous night had changed everything. He was no longer just trying to win a case, he was fighting for his life and the integrity of the legal system he had devoted his career to. Daniel was already at the cafe when Michael arrived, seated at a corner table with his laptop open, a serious expression on his face. Michael sat down, nodding briefly in greeting. "What do you have?" he asked without preamble. Daniel's fingers tapped nervously on the table as he spoke. "I've been working all night. I traced the payments to Melissa, but it wasn't easy. They went through multiple shell companies, all offshore. Whoever set this up knew exactly what they were doing." "Did you find the source?" Michael pressed, his voice tense. Daniel nodded, his eyes meeting Michael's. "I did. It all leads back to a law firm, a small but powerful one in DC. They specialize in cases involving high-profile clients and sensitive legal matters. But here's the kicker: they've got ties to several judges, politicians, and, most disturbingly, key players within our own DA's office." Michael felt a cold wave of realization wash over him. This wasn't just a conspiracy to manipulate one case, it was a deeply entrenched network, one that spanned multiple states and reached into the highest levels of government. And now, Michael was standing directly in their way. "Do we have enough to take them down?" Michael asked, though he already knew the answer. "Not yet," Daniel admitted. "We've got a trail, but it's not enough to bring down people this powerful. We need hard evidence, documents, recorded conversations, anything that directly links them to the corruption." Michael leaned back in his chair, his mind working furiously. They were close, but without solid proof, any attempt to expose the conspiracy would be brushed aside, or worse, they'd be silenced before they could make their case public. And that was assuming they could even find a platform that wasn't compromised. "We'll need to go after them in a way they won't expect," Michael said slowly, his thoughts beginning to form into a plan. "They've been careful, but everyone slips up eventually. We need to find that slip and exploit it." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "How do you propose we do that?" "Through Melissa," Michael replied, his voice hardening with resolve. "She's been inside their operation. She knows things, even if she doesn't realize it yet. We need her to keep playing her role, but this time, she'll be feeding us the information we need to trap them." Daniel frowned. "You're going to trust her? After everything?" Michael shook his head. "I don't trust her. But she's scared, and she's desperate. That makes her dangerous, but it also makes her useful. If she wants to get out of this alive, she'll help us." The plan was risky, but it was the only way Michael could see to expose the conspiracy. They would have to play a dangerous game, one that could cost them everything. But if they succeeded, they could bring down a network of corruption that had gone unchecked for years. Daniel agreed to continue digging, focusing on the law firm and its connections. Michael would meet with Melissa later that evening, laying out the plan and convincing her to work with them. The stakes were clear: either they brought the conspiracy to light, or they would be buried by it. That evening, Michael met Melissa in a quiet park, away from the bustling city. The tension between them was palpable as they sat on a bench beneath the dim glow of a street lamp. Melissa looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her movements jittery. "Why did you ask me here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael took a deep breath, knowing this moment could determine their fates. "We need your help," he said bluntly. "I know you're in deep, but you're not the only one. This isn't just about you or me anymore, it's about bringing down the entire operation that's been manipulating cases and corrupting the justice system." Melissa's eyes widened in fear. "You don't understand, Michael. These people, they're not just lawyers and judges. They have connections everywhere. If we go after them, they'll kill us. They almost did last night. I know, Michael replied, his tone firm. But you don't have a choice anymore. If you keep playing along, they'll dispose of you when they're done. But if you help us, we can protect you. We can bring them down, but only if you cooperate. Melissa hesitated, her fear palpable. How do I know I can trust you? How do I know you can protect me? You don't, Michael said honestly. But it's your best chance. Work with us, and we'll make sure this ends with them behind bars, not us. You're already involved, Melissa. It's time to choose a side. The silence stretched between them as Melissa wrestled with her decision. Finally, she nodded, her face set with determination. Okay. I'm in. What do you need me to do? Michael outlined the plan. Melissa would continue her role, acting as if nothing had changed. She would gather information, subtly planting doubts among those she interacted with, while feeding Michael and Daniel the intel they needed to tie everything together. It was a dangerous game, but it was the only option they had. Over the next several days, the tension in the courthouse was nearly unbearable. Michael continued his work on the Ford case, all the while coordinating with Daniel and Melissa in secret. Every move they made felt like walking a tightrope, one wrong step away from disaster. But the more they uncovered, the clearer the picture became. The law firm in D.C. was at the center of it all, coordinating efforts to manipulate high-stakes cases across the country. Their reach extended into law enforcement, politics, and the judiciary, ensuring that the people they wanted protected stayed that way, and those who opposed them were silenced. Melissa's information proved invaluable. She managed to obtain recordings of conversations between Ford's legal team and other players in the conspiracy, discussing payments, case manipulation, and the elimination of threats. Michael and Daniel compiled everything into a dossier, carefully documenting every connection, every payment, every act of corruption. Finally, they had enough. Michael knew the time had come to act. They couldn't go to the authorities directly, not without risking being silenced before the truth could be revealed. Instead, Michael arranged a press conference, leaking just enough information to draw public attention without tipping off the conspirators. The morning of the press conference, the tension was at a breaking point. Michael, Daniel, and Melissa gathered in a secure location, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them. "Are you ready for this?" Daniel asked, his voice steady but his eyes reflecting the gravity of the situation. Michael nodded. "It's now or never." As they stepped out in front of the cameras, Michael's heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment everything would change, the moment they either exposed the conspiracy or were swallowed by it. Michael began speaking, laying out the evidence they had gathered, detailing the corruption that had infiltrated the justice system. He named names, revealed connections, and presented the recordings that tied it all together. The room was silent, the weight of the revelations hanging in the air. But as Michael continued, a movement at the back of the room caught his eye. A man in a suit, standing near the exit, his hand moving inside his jacket. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the man, one of the figures from the alley. Everything seemed to slow down as the man pulled a gun, his eyes locking onto Michael. In an instant, chaos erupted. The man raised the weapon, and Michael saw his life flash before his eyes. But before the gunman could fire, Daniel lunged forward, tackling Michael to the ground as the shot rang out. Screams filled the room, reporters ducking for cover, cameras capturing the chaos. Michael hit the floor hard, pain shooting through his side. He rolled over, struggling to see through the pandemonium. Daniel was on the ground beside him, blood seeping through his shirt. The gunman was tackled by security, the weapon clattering to the floor. Michael scrambled to his feet, rushing to Daniel's side. "Stay with me," he urged, his voice breaking. "We're almost there, Daniel. Just hang on." But Daniel's eyes were already glazing over, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We did it, Michael," he whispered, a faint smile on his lips. "We did it." And then, Daniel was gone. The rest was a blur. The paramedics, the flashing lights, the questions from the police. Michael answered mechanically, his mind numb. They had exposed the conspiracy, but the cost had been high, too high. In the days that followed, the story exploded in the media. The recordings were played on every news channel, the names Michael had revealed became headlines, and the public demanded justice. The law firm was raided, arrests were made, and the network of corruption began to unravel. Melissa disappeared, her fate unknown. Some said she fled the country, others believed she was in hiding, waiting for the dust to settle. Michael didn't know, and in truth, he didn't care. She had made her choice, just as he had made his. But as the dust settled and the legal proceedings began, Michael found little solace in the victory. The system he had sworn to protect had been revealed as deeply flawed, and the price for exposing the truth had been paid in blood. Daniel's sacrifice haunted him, a reminder of the cost of doing what was right in a world where justice was often a mirage. The public would never know the full story, the shadows that still lingered behind the scenes. But Michael knew. And as he stood alone in his office, the city lights flickering outside, he wondered if it had all been worth it. He had won the battle, but the war for justice was far from over. Now that you've walked through the shadowy corridors of power and corruption with Michael Rourke, it's time to reflect. If you were in Michael's shoes, facing a system rigged from the inside, would you have made the same choices? Would you risk everything, your career, your life, to expose the truth, or would you have taken a different path? In a world where justice is not always black and white, and the lines between right and wrong are constantly shifting, what would your final decision be? Join the conversation. What do you think was Michael's biggest mistake, or was it all inevitable from the start? Could he have saved Daniel, or was the price of truth always going to be this high? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to catch the next legal thriller. There's always another case, another twist, and another dark secret waiting to be uncovered. Will you be ready for it?